Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the beginnings of a functional behavioral assessment and what we need to do utilizing best practices and legally defensible practices. So let's begin with discussion of best practices for assessment and our review or our talking again, our discussion again of our RIOT practices, RIOT. And in doing standard psychoeducational assessment, this has probably been well ingrained in your practice and in what you're doing. And that RIOT acronym stands for review, interview, observe, and test. Those same principles apply to functional behavioral assessment and functional analysis assessment. We'll revisit that in a second. Before we do that, let's talk about one of the things that we need to do always when we go to do an assessment, and that is we need to notify parents. So every time we're going to do a functional behavioral assessment or a functional analysis assessment, if parents haven't been already notified in terms of our paperwork and formally in the procedure that's led up to the determination that we need to do a functional behavioral assessment or a functional analysis assessment, then we need to do that. So as school psychologists, we'll need to make sure that the parents have been notified that that's our intention to do that. We'll also need to gather, if it's not part of another larger psychoeducational assessment, a triennial or an annual, we will need to, and this is a special purpose functional behavioral assessment or a functional analysis assessment, we'll need to get permission to assess. So we'll need to send home, get our parents our permission to assess paperwork, send it to the families, and then get that returned before we begin. So now, going back to our acronym that we're pretty well versed in with respect to typical psychoeducational assessments for determination for annuals, triennials, or for initial evaluations to determine special education eligibility and or placement. That RIOT acronym, review, interview, observe, and test, we're going to replace the test with an A, assess, so it's consistent in our terminology. So with respect to review, what we'll do is conduct a typical QM review. We'll look to see if any behavior assessments have been conducted in the past. We'll look into any other records in the QM that are available that would pertain to behavioral history, behavior assessment, medications, any other type of psychoeducational assessments as well. We would probably want to be aware and have reviewed those. Well, after we've done that, we'll want to conduct an interview with all the personnel that are involved. Immediately, I would think that probably if we're doing a functional behavioral assessment, we'll probably want to talk to the classroom teacher, as he or she has probably had some experience with the problem behavior. We will probably also maybe want to discuss this with the paraprofessional, if there's a paraprofessional involved. Oftentimes there are with younger students, elementary level students, kindergarten, preschool students, that sort of thing. We'll want to have a discussion with the paraprofessional to also gather their information. If there is any other professionals, speech, occupational therapy, adaptive PE, the principal, the vice principal, or any other people who are familiar with and concerned about this problem behavior, we should include them. Let's also not forget, if we can interview parents, that would be helpful as well, because they can provide us with a wealth of information that's available. We should also, and very important and specified out in the law for functional and behavioral assessment as well as functional analysis assessment, is that we should make sure to schedule formal and structured observation of the student in the environment that the problem behavior occurs. And what I mean by that, or what is meant by that, is that we should go and observe the student in the classroom if the classroom is the context where the problem behavior is occurring. So, and that observation should be sufficient in length to observe the behavior once or twice if it's possible. We would want to see one or two, maybe three occasions of the behavior. think of this in terms of when you do this observation, because of the magnitude of the assessment, because of the need, and because of the context that's given rise to the assessment, is you'll probably spend an hour or 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, observing the student in their classroom to try to capture a good understanding of the context, of the behavior of the student themselves. Lastly is when we'll conduct our assessment. We'll give out our questionnaires, we will give out our support forms and our rating systems and our rating scales to be able to gather additional information that's necessary to develop our functional behavioral assessment. So again, it's RIOT or RIA as we're going to use it. So it's review, interview, observe, and last, assess. Now let's talk a little bit about observation systems and some of our data collection methods and some of the ways that we can look at and analyze behavior. One of them, the first one that we'll talk about, is probably the one that we utilize 75, 80, 85% of the time, and that's called frequency, or sometimes referred to as frequency counts. And what those are essentially are counts of behaviors, or counts of times that the thing is happening. So for example, if we're talking about times out of seat or number of times out of seat, we can simply count every time the student gets up and out of their seat. Okay? Another thing that we can talk about is rate. And rate is similar to frequency, however, it has a time component. So we're looking at how often they get out of seat within a 10-minute period, and we get a metric for that. Again, we'll talk a little bit more in our readings, we'll talk a little bit more about how we mathematically compute that number, but that's essentially what it is a frequency count over a specific unit of time, and that gives us a rate metric. Another issue or another observation and data collection method that we can use is a duration measure. Duration measures look at how long a particular behavior is occurring from start to finish. And what we mean by that is, with the same example of a student that gets up out of their chair and is disrupting the class, if we think it's more appropriate to record the duration of time that they get up and they're out of their chair versus the time that they're in their chair, then we would use a duration measure. So duration would relate to or pertain to the amount of time from when the student first got out of his or her chair to the time when they returned to their chair. Okay? Another data collection method is latency. And essentially, a latency looks at the amount of time it takes for a student to perform the behavior once given an instruction. For example, if the teacher said, "Okay, class, take out your notebooks and let's begin to write the short summary of the lesson that we just heard." Latency would be how much time it took from the end of that instruction by the teacher until the student took their notebook out. And if you haven't seen this before, you'll see it in your practice in school psychologist. There will be times when a class or a teacher will come to you and say, "I tell the class to take out their notebooks and it's time for us to start writing our stories." And student A takes 10 minutes to do that. So by the time they get their notebook out, we're concluding that activity and starting another activity. Therefore, student A never completes the activity and is never involved in it. So in those situations, latency might be an appropriate measure. In addition, commonly used in school settings are percentages. And we can look at the percentage of assignments that a student turned in. If they, over the course of a week, they have 10 assignments to turn in, or 10 assignments to complete within a classroom, and they turn in 5 of them, then obviously they're turning in about 50% of their assignments. If the course criteria is for them to turn in 100% of their assignments, then we have a problem and probably a teacher referral. Last but not least are something that's called trials to criterion. So essentially it is, how many times does it take for this student to practice this particular behavior before they do it in a way that we want it to be done? This is generally data collection method that's used with teaching new behaviors, or new skills. And if you could think this through, this would be probably most appropriate towards, or most easily understood if you looked at it in terms of that you are trying to learn how to perform a new sports activity or a new dance step. And if it took you 5 repetitions of that, that's how many repetitions it took you to get it to criterion. So in addition, you guys, when we conduct our functional behavioral assessments and when we're really thinking about that, we should look pretty thoroughly at the environment that the behavior is occurring in. When I say environment, what I mean is the classroom, or if it's on the yard, or if it's in the PE, the gym, or any other environment that it could be taking place in. We want to do a thorough assessment of what's going on. We want to look for things like, is it loud? Is it disruptive? Is it chaotic? Are there other people that could be contributing to this? Are there other students that could be contributing to that? All those variables could come into play. And let me give you just an example of this recently. I was called to do an observation and make some consultation recommendations for a student in middle school. And the referral behavior, or the problem that was at hand, was that the student was never on task and very disruptive. So I had spoke to the RSP teacher beforehand, who had told me a little bit about the situation. And when I went to go sit in the classroom, I sat in the back, I observed, I noticed that the entire classroom was really loosely structured, and all the other students were engaging in the same types of behavior as the student that was brought to my attention for referral. And so that's the kind of thing that you want to kind of look at also. Look at your student and how they relate to other students, how they compare to other students. Is it what's going on with our student any different from what's going on with any of the other students in the class? And that'll help give us the information that we kind of need to have to determine or to develop a good functional behavioral assessment.